Committee members, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we are going to be briefed on the work of the University of Saskatchewan's Global Institute for Water Security. And before us, we have witnesses Mr. J. Familietti, David Rudolph, and Amina Stoddart. Stoddart, sorry, there's a mistake here, so I wasn't watching your name. So you each have 5 to 7 minutes because it's a 45-minute round and everybody wants to ask you a question. So with that, who's starting off? Mr. Familietti.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Chair Ratansi, Vice Chairs Finlay and Pose, and members of the committee. My name is Jay Familietti. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, where I hold the Canada 150 Chair in Hydrology and Remote Sensing. I'm also the lead organizer of today's Water Day on the Hill, for which we brought 24 water scientists from 14 universities and from 7 different provinces to Ottawa to talk with you about our science, that is, the science of water. We're here today to directly communicate our science to you because it's compelling, and also because it's our responsibility to keep you informed, and because we want you to know that we are here for you. When you need information on a certain water topic, please do not hesitate to reach out. In my research, I use satellites and I develop computer models to track how freshwater availability is changing all over the world. The map shown on these screens was produced by my team and our collaborators using a NASA satellite called GRACE, which stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. The GRACE mission, which flew from 2002 through 2017, behaved more like a scale than a typical satellite, which we might think of like a spaceborne camera. Instead, GRACE literally weighed the regions of the world that were gaining water, shown in blue, and that were losing water, shown in red. Broadly speaking, the map has a background pattern whereby the high and low latitude regions of the world, the already wet regions, are getting wetter, shown by the light blue background colors, and the mid-latitude regions of the world in between, that is, the already dry areas, are getting drier, shown by the lighter red and orange background colors. The map is then dotted with what I call hotspots for water insecurity. These are places where there is too much water, shown by the deeper blue spots, for example, due to flooding becoming more extreme, or places where there is too little water, shown by the deeper red spots, due to more pronounced drought or due to the overexploitation of groundwater. The map paints a picture of humans, then, as the driving force of a very rapidly changing freshwater landscape, for example, due to climate change, which is causing the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets and alpine glaciers like those in Alaska and British Columbia to melt, contributing to sea level rise and impacting the source of stream flow in our rivers. We can also see a number of deep red spots across the mid-latitudes of the world, including those in California, Texas, the Middle East, India, Bangladesh, Beijing, and several more. These primarily represent the disappearance of groundwater from the world's major aquifers. In most regions around the world, the groundwater in these aquifers is being massively overpumped to provide irrigation water to fuel global food production. A profound lack of governance and management the world over allows this overexploitation to continue largely unabated. The upshot of this map is that not only is our global water security at risk, but so too is our global food security. Canada is not immune to these issues. It too is less water secure than is generally appreciated. Looking at the GRACE map, we can see the impact of melting ice across the Canadian West, the North, and the Northeast, and the cumulative impact of flooding across Alberta and Western Saskatchewan. This is consistent with climate model predictions of how climate change will impact Canada through melting ice and permafrost, shorter snow seasons, more liquid rain rather than snowfall in the mountains, all of which will lead to changes in the timing of stream flow and freshwater availability for people, for agriculture, and for the environment, and to greater oscillations between flooding and drought. Except that it's already happening now, and it's happening at rates that are quicker than our models project, and it's happening at rates that are so quick that we are unable to prepare for them. Canadian water scientists like myself and my colleagues are working on continuing these observations and developing new ones, and we'll be talking with you about them today. We're thinking about their implications and how to best prepare Canada for its more complicated water future and therefore its more complicated food and energy futures. We're thinking about things like integrated river basin planning, the need for national scale flood, groundwater, and water availability forecasting, and the need for new governance paradigms for global groundwaters, or for a Canada Water Agency that can circumvent the fractured nature of water management that is so common in developed countries, yet which stands in the way of the urgent need to address the many issues that are becoming visible in this map. I'll close by saying that the rapid pace of change of our freshwater landscape certainly presents many challenges, but it also presents an opportunity to show how a nation like Canada can lead the world towards managing the way through to sustainable national and global water futures. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody is recording, please don't record. The security doesn't like it. Somebody recording? Nope? Okay, thank you. Mr. Rudolph.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here with the committee today. My name is Dave Rudolph. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the University of Waterloo. And today I'd like to talk about three main points associated with Canada's subsurface water resources, or groundwater. So groundwater is rapidly emerging as one of Canada's most strategic natural resources, influencing current topics related to environment and sustainable development. Yet it probably is the nation's most poorly understood resource. And a part of it is because it tends to be out of sight and out of mind. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of current groundwater use in Canada, just to give an idea of how Canadians use it. And then I'd like to go through a variety of questions related to emerging issues that are environmentally impacting groundwater at a national scale, and will have social and economic impacts on a wide range of issues, and I'll provide a couple of examples for that. And then finally, I've got a couple of recommendations that might help us ensure that we stay proactive as we manage groundwater resources moving forward. So at a global scale, as Professor Famiglietti had presented just a moment ago, groundwater represents an enormous component of our accessible fresh water. Approximately 95 to 98% of accessible fresh water is in the groundwater reserve. So it's available throughout the world, and it's depended on significantly. In Canada, between the years 1970 and 2015, our dependence on groundwater went from about 10% to about 33%. So in that short time period, we're progressively turning towards groundwater as a substantial resource. That's about 10 million Canadians using groundwater on a daily basis. And we expect this dependency to grow, yet it's quite variable across Canada. So for instance, in Prince Edward Island and the Yukon Territories, it's 100% of the supply that's used. Across the Prairie provinces, around 30%. Ontario, maybe 30 to 40%. It gives you an idea of how substantial it is across Canada. There's clear evidence now that groundwater will be a crucial component in helping us mitigate against climate change. Again, part of what you saw just a moment ago illustrates that. Because of climate warming, and it'll help us to maintain this economic growth we're looking for and a standard of living for our future Canadians. But there are challenges, as I mentioned, coming forward, and I'd like to mention just a few. First relates to the decades of land use management and resource development that has resulted in slow and chronic degradation of groundwater quality. That's now beginning to threaten municipal water supplies and ecosystem health across Canada. Slow moving, but arriving now at our doorstep. Particularly challenging are examples you may know of. Urban road de-icers are particularly difficult. Agricultural nutrient management and retired metal and petroleum mining operations across Canada. A second point I'd like to refer to is the emergence of new contaminants of concern, ones that we may never have anticipated before. One that's particularly prevalent these days is a series of substances referred to as pre- or polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. You may have heard the term, that are being widely detected in the environment, tend to be bioaccumulating, and as yet we don't know how to deal with them and what the health effects are. This is something that's changing very quickly. The U.S. Department of Defense recently invested $100 million in PFAS research just in the last few months, groundwater appearing to be one of the most substantial vectors of movement. The third issue I'll point to just for this morning is the identification of hundreds of thousands of abandoned oil and gas wells across Canada, all of which are indicating potential impact on groundwater threats. Right here in Ontario, we have 25,000 of these abandoned wells, something that's really not well known under the Great Lakes, around them, all through Ontario. That type of threat is not understood very well. The overall environmental economic legacy of it is still under consideration. One of the biggest challenges, of course, in groundwater management is its jurisdictional responsibility is divided between municipal, provincial, and federal governments, which makes it challenging to manage it in the long run. However, I think because of the strategic significance of the nation's groundwater and how it's changing so rapidly, federal leadership is critical moving forward. And to that light, I'd like to point out two major documents that have been substantial that the federal government has developed over the last few years. In 2003, NRCan initiated a national committee to develop a Canadian framework for collaboration in groundwater. That document provides a really good roadmap for governance. It's as timely now as it was then, and it's gained international attention. It's being used in lots of parts of the world. Something that's available. I tried to bring a bilingual version of it for you today. I've only found the English version, but it's online on the NRCan website. The second one is a document the federal government commissioned to the Council of Canadian Academies in 2009, referred to as the Sustainable Management of Groundwater in Canada. It's an excellent reference, and I brought both French and English versions of it today, and I'll leave it with the chair at the end of the day. Again, CCA developed that document. Now, both of them are totally relevant, lots of great information. As a result of the changes I mentioned going forward, we need to revisit some of the topics. So to close, some recommendations moving forward. I think groundwater needs to be fully integrated into all of our conversations regarding environment sustainable development in Canada, and particularly as we consider the creation of the new Canada Water Agency. It plays a substantial role, and one of the opportunities for us now, I think, is to state another national scale committee to evaluate the current status of groundwater in Canada, to provide the advice to the federal government and provincial government authorities in developing the Canadian Water Agency. Building on the excellence that's already come out, those two documents I mentioned there, a great way to start, and engaging Canada's groundwater and hydrogeology expertise in academia, in government, and in private business. It's recognized worldwide. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Madame Stola.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for providing me the opportunity to address the committee today. My name is Dr. Amina Stoddard. I am an assistant professor in the Center for Water Resources Studies in the Department of Civil and Resource Engineering at Dalhousie University. Together with my colleagues in the Center for Water Resources Studies, I work closely with communities, water and wastewater utilities, engineering consultants, and technology providers within the water sector to investigate and provide solutions for water and wastewater treatment challenges. For example, I'm currently leading a research partnership with water and wastewater utility Halifax Water to optimize wastewater treatment approaches to ensure compliance with the federal wastewater system effluent regulations and investigate and address emerging wastewater treatment priorities. This wastewater research builds on a long-term partnership in drinking water treatment research between Dalhousie University and Halifax Water, which I had the opportunity to be a part of as a researcher. Madam Chair, it is well known and accepted that climate change affects water quantity. We see threats to the availability of water through drought conditions, as well as scenarios such as flooding and sea level rise, where we simply have too much water. While water quantity is a concern, one less visible and poorly understood challenge is the impact that climate change has on water quality. Historically, water and wastewater treatment plant design has been based on regulatory compliance approach, where the focus is on ensuring that treated drinking water or wastewater is below specific concentrations for various water quality parameters at the drinking water tap or at the end of the wastewater effluent pipe. This approach is based on periodic sampling, logbooks, and a narrow view of water quality, as I will describe. From this approach, there is a notable absence of consideration for changes in water quality that may occur over time due to climate change. The water quality of our drinking water source, such as a lake or a groundwater well, plays a pivotal role in the performance of water treatment plants and ultimately impacts the water quality at our tap. While seasonality is recognized and accounted for in design, long-term changes that subtly transform a drinking water source are simply not accounted for under present design paradigms. But this is what is happening to our water quality. In 2017, our team published research that demonstrated an increased operational burden on water treatment utilities as a result of regional climate changes impacting the water quality at the source over a 15-year period. Our work showed that due to climate-driven increases in water pH and natural organic matter concentrations, one drinking water treatment plant required nearly a quadrupling in treatment chemical dose over a period of 15 years in order to continue to achieve drinking water quality standards. These additional chemical costs required more trucks to ship chemical agents and waste from the plant. To put it another way, climate change resulted in poorer water quality in the lake source and increased greenhouse gas emissions. To be clear, these water quality changes were subtle on a day-to-day timescale, but when we observed them retrospectively over more than a decade, we observed a large, impactful change to water quality that we do not see reversing, but rather accelerating. We are now studying this on a larger scale with Halifax Water and other utilities, including New York Department of Environmental Protection and Tampa Bay Water, as well as academic colleagues in the UK. The broad consensus is that we have an imminent challenge that exists for both water and wastewater facilities. To adapt to climate change, utilities will ultimately need to consider modularity in design and draw from robust data streams to inform operations. In light of this, our research team has been working toward modular design solutions that can be employed during times of challenging water quality to assist utilities in achieving water quality goals. With respect to data streams, conventionally, regulatory compliance is determined on a very low number of water quality measurements, considering millions of liters of water may be produced each day. In this framework, a boil water advisory, for example, is often reduced down to a few coliform measurements. As an answer to this, our research team has looked closely into artificial intelligence as a means to provide robust decision support data to help improve water quality through a risk management approach. Ultimately, this is not a small task in front of us. However, the potential of a national water agency creates a strong signal that acknowledges the challenge and the need to prioritize water quality for Canadians. In closing, I want to inform you that as an assistant professor, I am in the very early days of my research career. However, it is clear that the impact that climate change is having on water quality is already profound and will undoubtedly shape and inform my research career. Thank you again for the invitation. I look forward to future dialogue.
Thank you very much, and I know you had to speed through your presentation. We have only one round of 6 minutes because of the time constraint, so we'll start off with Mr. Reddycall.
Thank you. And I'm sure everybody's chomping at the bit. There's lots of things to ask questions about. I want to ask, kind of following up a little bit on this about sewage. You guys do study on that, and you probably are aware of the report that came out a couple of weeks ago from Environment Canada posted the information about the raw sewage that is being dumped into Canada's freshwater system. In 2018 alone, the raw sewage output is up 44% under the current government over in 2013 when the Conservatives are in power. What comments would you guys make about that and jurisdictions that are putting raw sewage into our water system? Sure.
Yeah, I can respond. So the wastewater system effluent regulations have been implemented, and these require that wastewater systems meet a requirement for different effluent quality. And this is resulting in a response from many utilities to improve the water quality that is coming out of their water treatment plants.
Right, and so, but yet it still continues, right? We have a lot of this in different areas, do we not?
Yes. So there are the wastewater system effluent regulations. They allow water treatment plants to apply for what's called transitional authorization, which allows them to have until 2020, 2040 to meet the wastewater system effluent regulations. It takes time for utilities to gather the resources and study the systems that are appropriate for them in order to meet the regulations.
Do you guys think that is a reasonable amount of time for getting that under control?
I think so. I think the timelines that have been applied take into account the sort of a risk-based framework for how the water quality, the receiving body, will respond, and that risk-based approach applies this idea of having until 2020 or 2040 to meet the regulations.
And do you folks do work on the ocean side of it as well? Is that part of what you do? So it's all fresh.
It's all the freshwater world.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing about it is as climate change is changing the hydrologic balance in so many different aspects of our system, stream flow, what we depend on for assimilating waste going into rivers and streams is more variable now. And we don't quite understand what happens at different times. Different seasonalities are causing this type of uncertainty. So as we move forward, taking into account how stream flow will be impacted by climate change and how we use it as a assimilating component is something we have to keep in mind as well.
Right. And another area that sort of along similar lines, I guess, is on Indigenous drinking water. Obviously, that's an issue in our country. There's still a lot of bad drinking water. What have you guys done research in that area, or what do you have any comments about that?
I work with colleagues in the Center for Water Resource Studies who have been working with First Nations communities on drinking water issues, particularly with the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nation Chiefs. In terms of technology, I've had the chance to work with my colleagues on a few projects with these communities. One of the technologies that we're looking at and that they talked about within my statement are risk-based approaches, so water safety planning to support communities as they seek to improve their water quality.
So do you guys see challenges in that area? Is there enough resources, funding, those types of things?
Yeah, I think resources are always a challenge, and there certainly is always opportunity for more support. But I think investigating new technologies like water safety plans is a good approach.
Right.
May I follow up on that? Sure. So we have at the Global Institute for Water Security several scientists who work with Indigenous populations. There's a couple of issues that come to mind. One is often that our Indigenous partners are not even at the table when we are having, say, basin-wide discussions, say, on the Saskatchewan River Basin. And so that certainly has to change. I recently read an article about the unevenness of the water treatment plants across the various Indigenous and First Nations populations. There's a lack of training of facility operators. Sometimes the facilities are built in the wrong place. They're built, say, upstream of maybe an intake valve or something like that. So we have a long way to go.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Canada Water Agency. You mentioned that a few times. Maybe just tell me a little bit more about what that would look like and what the challenges in putting that together will be.
First of all, I think it's very impressive that we're actually talking about something like this in Canada. A lot of nations talk about it, as many of you know. I'm from the United States, and we haven't had those sorts of discussions. So one of the big problems is the fractured nature of water management. And I think I mentioned that at the end of my talk. And so that makes it very difficult to get coordinated policy on all the things that we were just talking about. Dave was talking about groundwater. Amina is talking about drinking water and treatment and some of these Indigenous issues. And so there's a real need to bring things together. I see this, it's my opinion, I think it should be composed, or it should allow for various levels of government to come together, as well as universities and researchers, so that maybe through the agency or maybe through, say, a center where the agency is housed. There are some really important topics that, we've sort of summarized it. The way we set up our talks, we want to kind of give a full spectrum of what's happening with water. But there are some major issues we need to deal with, and one is integrated and collaborative river basin management. So the collaborative part is bringing the different groups together. The integrated is thinking about the surface water, thinking about the groundwater, thinking about the industrial side and the managed side. And we need to be bringing these things together both observationally and in
I have
models.
to stop you there. I even gave him a grace of 1 more minute. Mr. Scott, but you can answer it when somebody else asks you the question.
Well, actually, I would like to continue along the lines of Mr. Redekop's questioning in terms of, what to your mind, a Canada Water Agency would look like. Is it something that should be, or the process of it coming into being, I guess, is what I'm really more concerned about. In your view, is it something that should be quite comprehensive from the start? Like, you were saying we need to bring together, universities and provinces and integrate all of this, all of these players and conduct studies. Is that the approach that should be taken? In which case, the next question becomes, how much do we integrate? Because, as you know, water is so fast. I mean, we could continue to expand the scope of the agency, or is the better approach to focus on a couple of bite-sized problematic areas? Climate forecasting, flood forecasting. Last Thursday, I went to a briefing at the Canadian Meteorological Centre, and I thought there was plenty of subject matter there to occupy Canada Water Agency for quite a while, with some practical outputs, if you will. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get your sense as to what a Canada Water Agency will look like, and how we get there. Do we start small, or do we do something comprehensive, with a big bang at the start?
Right. Okay. So thank you for that question. I don't want to hog the microphone too much because I've already spoken on this a little bit, but I do like the idea of picking 3 or 4, imagine them as bullet points, and these would be the focus areas. And so, climate change and how that's impacting flooding. Creating and mobilizing, observations and making data available, right? I mean, we do again, many nations around the world don't do a great job with that. Looking at the Canada Water Act and thinking about modernizing that, and again, having the inclusivity in there, including groundwater, including what we know about climate change, all these things are missing. So those are sort of 3 bullet points right there. You're right. I mean, water, we could go on and on and on, and I appreciate your comment that maybe it's better to focus on a few key things and make some progress than try to do too many things.
My second question is somewhat related, and it's to is it Dr. Rudolph? Dr. Rudolph, you mentioned federal leadership on groundwater. What does that look like? I mean, because it is a provincial jurisdiction. We do some work at NRCan in terms of measuring groundwater. What does federal leadership on groundwater look like? And the answer, I guess, would feed into Dr. Familietti's response as to about the Canada Water Agency having a component that looks at groundwater. What does it look like?
So, great question, and it's part of I think the challenge in managing groundwater, and it always has been. It's not just in Canada that has that issue. I've worked in California for quite some time and have a very similar state versus federal initiative. In the United States, the federal government provides access and compilation of data, as Jay was making a reference to, that I think only the federal government has the ability to pull together and combine and make that information available to the provincial authorities for making decisions that are appropriate. The Canadian Water Agency, based on your recommendation there or suggestion, could help work on priority issues that are relevant on a provincial basis. So if you start in where Amina works and goes across Canada to Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, The provincial water issues are very, very different. Flooding's a critical issue in some areas. Some areas, it's abandoned oil wells. And in the north, it's thawing permafrost that's happening very, very quickly, impacting all of the infrastructure up there. The Canadian government, because you have NRCan, you have Environment Canada, you have Agriculture Canada, you have the forestry, all working on water, providing phenomenal insight in many different areas. If we could facilitate that to the provincial authorities to help them in their decision making, that gives federal guidance in a way that I think coordinates it. So I really like your idea of focusing on specific priority issues.
Thank you. I think I'll give it over to my colleague. My next question is quite involved. It was for Dr. Stoddart, but maybe we can chat offline. Lloyd?
Thanks, Francis. And thank you. I want to thank you to all of you for your presentations. I want to drill in a little bit more into the Canada Water Agency, which was a campaign commitment for the Liberal Party. In our campaign, we looked at how do we tie municipal, provincial, federal water jurisdictions together. I'm wondering what's currently existing. We have the Global Institute. I'm wondering about how the universities collaborate. Is there a network that we would be tying into of water researchers? And Dr. Rudolph, you work with Dr. Parker in Guelph, and she's a Canada Research Chair in groundwater. Guelph is groundwater fed, so it's very important for our community. Our drinking water doesn't come from a lake or a river, it comes from the ground. So it's very important for our community to be able to get the best technologies that we can. Looking at the Netherlands and other institutes across around the world. How does the network exist right now, and how could we tie into that?
So great question. And in Ontario, I can speak mostly from that point of view. What normally works is the municipalities reach out to the universities when there's a problem and a question, whether it be how much water is drawn for water bottling to a specific contamination problem. And they integrate with the university researchers individually and work on a problem. At the provincial level, it tends to be a bit of a broader, it's almost policy development. And they reach out to institutional individuals at institutions to help with developing policy. And that tends to work reasonably well, but it's case by case type of operation. It's not like, I would say, a fixed network that says, we can call on this group or this group. Many of the institutions are developing, as Jay leads at Saskatchewan. We have at Waterloo a Water Institute that combines about 140 different researchers. So if you phone one number to the Water Institute, the University of Waterloo, and say, we've got serious problems with E. coli outbreaks on a certain area, who do we talk to? You immediately get funneled towards that. So that's the type of network.
Madame Posé, pour 7 minutes, parce que le 2 est...
For 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. We know that the human body is composed 2/3 of water, so it's very essential for us. It's very important to have good quality water. In your presentation, I think it was Professor Famaliete, you talked about pollution of our water resources, our groundwater, and you mentioned pollutants that we don't even know the impact of. So I would like to know more comprehensively for chemicals. Are there better ways of regulating companies where those products are concerned?
Love to answer it if I possibly could, but really that was Dave who was making those comments.
Okay.
So very interestingly, the compounds we're looking at that are appearing in the environment entered the environment probably decades ago, and are moving towards release into streams through groundwater, slow groundwater movement. And the problem is the legacy and the release many years ago. I would say. Many of our companies, most of our companies, are very well regulated now, are very careful with many of their compounds and chemicals. It's the historical use of those chemicals that are now coming back to hit us. And in Canada, we were always protected by our volume of water and the overall dilution that the systems would provide. And now we're at a stage, because we've been doing this for 5 to 6 decades, that now we're starting to see it arrive at municipal public supply wells, in streams and rivers, places that the rest of the world had to deal with decades ago is now happening in Canada. But it's a legacy problem mostly when these were released.
D'accord, merci.
Thank you for that answer. On that, you're talking about other countries, but we know that water, and I'm glad that Mr. Scarpaleggia asked his question. We need to respect the jurisdiction of Quebec and the provinces, but municipalities are responsible for water treatment. When you look at what is going on in Quebec, what do you see happening with respect to water management?
Yeah, well, personally, I wish I was more familiar with the Quebec's system, so I'm not really able to comment on it directly. Would you be able to? No, in terms of what? Do you have a specific? Certainly, one of the things Quebec is doing is working on protection of source water. So they've led Canada in many ways in providing us information on how to manage data sets to be able to predict impacts in the longer term on a broader scale, on watershed scale. Quebec has done a really good job at that. They've also been doing an excellent job at compiling data and getting it ready and accessible to scientists and government authorities to use. So I think Quebec's ahead in many ways compared to different provinces, but I can't really comment on the technology and the treatment component of it. But certainly infrastructure is struggling.
Dans le fond, est-ce que
Basically, do you have any ties with organizations in Quebec that are working on water issues? And here I have a secondary question. What about the International Joint Commission, Canada, the U.S. and Quebec all participate in that? We have a huge water catchment area there through the St. Lawrence. So what are the ties with organizations like that and in Quebec? So
the ties that I'm most familiar with are with INRS in Quebec City and NRCan and the Geological Survey of Canada. From a federal level, those are the groups that, of course, stationed in Quebec that are most influential in understanding and managing the St. Lawrence Seaway, and as you say, a huge drainage basin through Quebec and surrounding areas into the St. Lawrence River. How that interacts with municipal and provincial governments, that I'm not clear on how that happens.
Et avec la commission
with the International Joint Commission, when it comes to the Great Lakes, what about them?
The International Joint Commission provides sort of a continuous monitoring of the giant watershed, the Great Lakes watershed, and feeds the information as they finish their studies into different levels of government. I see it probably primarily to provincial levels. And that information has been acted on continuously. It's giving people updates, particularly on the health of the Great Lakes right now. That's been a major issue on nutrient loading to the Great Lakes and Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and how that changes. The other one that Jay's team has been working on is the levels in the lakes and what the flow rates are in the lakes were extremely high over the last few years, and what that means in terms of managing transport and distribution in the lakes. So I think this International Joint Commission has done tremendous work. My only worry is that it doesn't reach its results out to everyone that can use it, and that comes back to this management and jurisdictional management problem. And communication, the Canadian Water Agency would really help with that. Thank you.
Dernière question rapide.
A very last quick question. I only have a little bit of time left. We know that in 2015 we had, with 192 other countries at the UN, the Year of Water Resources. We wanted to improve access to freshwater resources. Was your organization involved in helping get to that goal?
Yeah. So our when you say our agencies, you mean the universities overall, or our university particularly, the Water Institute was involved in it, and looking at it from a global point of view, where the areas that were most stressed to get fresh water to individuals, and certainly one of the areas was where our own Indigenous communities, which stays there as a high point.
Madame Collins, you'll get the same amount as everybody else did.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your presentations. And, it's so clear that our freshwater resources are so critical to the health and well-being of our ecosystems, our communities, our local economies. And in 2012, the Navigable Waters Protection Act was replaced by an act by the Harper government that stripped federal protections from 99% of navigable waters. And then in the last parliament, the Liberals brought in the Canadian Navigable Waters Act, which broadened some of those protections for waterways, but didn't fully restore the protections that were lost. And then in your view, what has been the impact of that kind of original loss of those crucial protections, and then also the failure to fully restore navigable water protection for all Canadian waterways?
So I'm looking at Amina, hoping she's going to bail us out. So let me plead the fact that I am a new Canadian. I've just become a permanent resident, and I've been here for less than 2 years. So I don't know the answer.
I'm about the same. I tend to work underground rather than above ground. But maybe specifically, if you tell us what you think the issues in your mind are in terms of navigation, in terms of access to the waterways, in terms of protection.
Really, in terms of protection.
Yeah.
I know kind of case by case, communities were advocating to restore those protections for their waterways. And I'm thinking particularly, so a community just north of my riding fought very hard to make sure that those waterways that had lost the protection under that original Navigable Waters Protection Act were restored, and that they haven't been.
So anyway, I'll make one point on that. One of the biggest threats is that our overall flow in the navigable waterways is changing rapidly. And it comes back to what Jay was talking about earlier. Because of climate change, we have a much more fluctuating base flow and runoff cycle. And without having control and being able to manage those waterways now, I think people will be at risk for not knowing exactly when it'll be safe to navigate them, what's coming up, what should we expect, flood conditions versus very low flow conditions. So probably your point's really well taken that as we move forward now with climate change potentially impacting these flows, it's even more important than it was before.
And so one of the communities so I used to sit on the Capital Regional District's watershed governance board, and one of the communities outside of our community, but because watersheds don't know borders, we're always looking at our surrounding area. One of the communities, Shawnigan Lake, had a contaminated soil dump that was proposed and began construction at the kind of head of the watershed of the drinking water for about 12,000 people. And they had liners that were projected to last for about 50 years, which I know that you had mentioned kind of that in the past there weren't those protections for companies or there weren't the regulations, and that now it seems like there is, just from following that one case, it did seem like the protections were there for the next 50 years, but what happens when that liner deteriorates? So I'm curious if you're seeing those kind of similar gaps. One of the things I know the provincial government is looking at the professional reliance model, which is the kind of way in which the company and regulators and engineers come together to make decisions about what's safe for communities. So I think that review is going to be helpful, but I'm curious about those regulations for things like contaminated soil dumps, toxic soil dumps that impact our drinking water and our groundwater.
Let me try that. Go ahead.
So just one comment. And this is where I think maybe revisions to the Canada Water Act and a National Water Agency can come into play. So there's actually a couple of comments. One is that when thinking about a framework for an agency or new policy, it's very important to think in terms of watersheds or aquifers and their intersections rather than political boundaries, right? Because that's water doesn't know those boundaries. So that's part of it. The other thing is that we now understand in ways that maybe we didn't 40 or 50 years ago, like Dave was saying, the lifetime of some of these things, and the fact that a 50-year horizon. Guess what? 50 years ago was 1970, and well, at least a few people in the room were alive at that point. And 50 years goes by pretty fast, and we probably need much longer time horizons. And we know the exceptionally long lifetimes of some of these chemicals, and some of them we don't even know because we haven't really anticipated their appearance in the environment. So I think that we need to be taking a much longer term view, especially if we have an opportunity to redo or recreate some of these agencies and policies.
Great. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So the engineering design of it to last 50 years is a challenge in itself. We're not very good at designing too many things that last longer than that. What they do include now are very sophisticated monitoring systems around these facilities. So they're compelled by law to track and monitor the environment around them. So if there happens to be a breach, something starts to move, you're looking for an early warning there. And that has really, really helped so that people have been able to make predictions and change things if there's been a leak. So make sure they keep an eye on the monitoring system. And just as 10 seconds, it could be a compound coming out of that contaminated soil that we don't even know about yet. It's a problem. And that's the emerging contaminant challenge that we have. Several asked about that. So anyway, that gives us at least some safeguard to something failing.
Thank you, and your time is up, actually. Thank you very much, witnesses, for being here. And if you have additional information or things that you would like to send to the committee, please do so. And with that, I'll suspend it for a couple of minutes to let the new witnesses come.